The philosopher and cultural critic Theodor Adorno wrote, "The principal demand upon all education is that Auschwitz does not happen again. It precedes any other requirement in such a way that I believe I need not and should not justify it. I cannot understand why it has been given so little concern until now." Adorno wrote his famous essay, Education After Auschwitz, in 1966. He uttered his critique during a period in German history in which a deadly silence about the fascist history was deeply ingrained in the country's consciousness, its educational institutions, and in the churches. Since the late 70s, things have changed drastically. Adorno's essay became a kind of manifesto. It inspired a heightened sense of responsibility for myriads of academics, educators, therapists, clergy, politicians, and artists, all who tried to make sense of their work and perhaps more fundamentally, their purpose in life in the aftermath of violence, in the aftermath of Auschwitz. The principal demand upon all education is that Auschwitz does not happen again. In the 21st century, Adorno's challenge has found new expressions. Since Adorno wrote, especially the call to remember has been complicated through a variety of factors that theologians and religious educators need to grapple with. For a broader international perspective, it would be important to figure out if some of the issues I'm going to raise are of significance for other circumstances as well, or if they have to be stated differently, since the contexts of remembering violence vary drastically. For instance, such contexts could be the remembrance of slavery in the context of persistent structural racism in the United States, the remembrance of the disappeared ones in countries such as Argentina or Chile. In these countries, preceding governments had initiated, persecuted, and sponsored violence, torture and murder against persons who were marked and scapegoated as enemies of the state. The remembrance of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 comes to mind, in which by means of systematic preparation and planning, an explosion of violence has occurred that was unheard of before. Hundreds of thousands of Tutsis were killed. And in the second wave of raging killing, thousands of Hutus as well. And finally, the memory of apartheid in South Africa is a significant example. The named circumstances are radically different as they arise from particular historical constellations, yet it seems to me that such radically distinct situations imply some shared questions as well. I would like to identify the following issues as a shared horizon. These aspects are also crucial for a debate on cultures of memory in the context of religious education. First, I would like to speak of fundamental concepts of memory. I suggest grounding the topic of remembering violence theoretically beyond the binary of an essentialist versus a presentist approach. An essentialist approach understands memories and images from history as straightforward representations of a past that is at the disposal of those who remember. Memory is then perceived as an object or a thing or as a discrete unit of reality. An essentialist approach operates with the following assumptions. Collective memory is understood as a homogenous unity which produces consensus and a sense of collective identity. It is grounded in mimetic directness, which means that collective memory in some way or another represents or mirrors a pre-representational past rather than being from the very first moment embodied in representational form. Collective memory is identified with tangible objects that are materialized in aesthetic productions such as monuments, music, poetry, or sacred texts. In contrast to this essentialist understanding, a presentist approach comprehends memories as mere constructions which serve certain purposes for the present. The way we remember our individual or our collective past is a highly subjective endeavor. In this subjectivist and functionalist view, acts of remembering become mainly an instrument to navigate diverging interests of various groups or individuals. I, however, would like to offer an alternative for the study of collective memory. Hereby, I draw on the proposal of the sociologist Jeffrey K. Olick, who has put forward a process-relational approach for the analysis of collective remembering. This theory focuses on collective remembering as a thoroughly interactive phenomenon, in which connections between the present and the past are constantly negotiated. In this vein, collective memory can be understood as a field which exists in constant flux. In this field, official and vernacular memory is navigated. Diverging narratives of a violent past might float around, which are shaped by public media, by the interventions of particular stakeholders, or by distinct forms of storytelling within certain communities. The field of collective memory is also in constant flux due to the transmission of narratives from one generation to the next. What does it mean for students who were born in the mid-90s to remember apartheid or the Berlin Wall? When it comes to generational memory, it seems necessary to explore the implicit and explicit curricula that deal with a violent past. On the one hand, scholars analyze the factors that help to shape a sense of collective identity and responsibility. And on the other hand, it is indispensable to comprehend the negative responses to such educational efforts when students react with aversion, when they feel they are fed up with dealing with the past, and when apathetic disinterest arises. Understanding collective memory as a field that is in constant flux takes also the issue of multiperspectivity into account. It depends from where you look, different insights emerge. The meaning of such multiperspectivity has been beautifully captured by a sculpture the artist Marco Gianfanelli has created. It is situated approximately 5 kilometers outside of the town of Howick, KwaZulu in KwaZulu-Natal. This is the exact spot where Nelson Mandela was arrested on August 5th, 1962. this spot marks the beginning of his detainment, which lasted for 27 years. The South African theologian Johann Cilliers interprets the sculpture as follows. The impressive sculpture consists of 50 steel poles between 8 and 10 meters tall, arranged in a pattern that at first seemingly portrays nothing else but fragments, shards of steel protruding from the ground. These poles symbolize the fragmented nature of South African society, pointing upwards like sighs soaring up to heaven. The shards of steel are reminiscent of isolation, of captivity, even of the iron bars of a jail cell, where Nelson Mandela spent 27 years of his life. But the first impression is obviously not the last. In a remarkable achievement of aesthetic reframing, the artist has created a work that springs to life when one views it from a specific angle and position. When the artwork is approached from the footpath leading down towards it, exactly 35 meters away, the laser-cut steel poles line up to create the illusion of a perfectly flat image. Then, the many fragments make up a whole, the shards from a face, that of Nelson Mandela. An education that initiates inquiries in a violent past should open up ways for students to explore such multiperspectivity of perception in the ways how we remember. I come to my second aspect, which hints at a shared horizon. The field of collective memory is contested and fluid, especially in the aftermath of incidents of genocide and state-sponsored violence. Oftentimes, major conflicts arise as social groups battle for the preeminence of a certain interpretation of what happened, who is to blame, and who should be punished. Thus, the past becomes key to interpreting the present and to shaping the future. Part of the educational endeavor must be to critically explore these fields of contestations. What are the political agendas of the present that shape the reconstructions of a violent past? Whose voices are marginalized or not heard? What are the themes that are suppressed or put into the foreground? Attending to a violent past is not just a matter of straightforward collection of facts. We also need to take into account that memory can be painful, that it escapes accessibility, or that it is distorted. Remembering violent events is by no means always a liberating thing, especially for those who have been actively involved in some way or another. Trauma theory attends to a sphere of knowing that is not representational. It is rather a comprehension that is itself continually terrorized and haunted by the violence, by the trauma of a past event. It is a knowing that remains incomplete Or, as Kathy Carruth articulates it, trauma does not simply serve as a record of the past, but precisely registers the force of an experience that is not yet fully owned. Trauma, in this sense, is a continual awakening to an event that was not fully understood, and because of this incompleteness is being incessantly made present. It remains a constant challenge in educational processes to understand how collective traumatization functions in particular social contexts. We are challenged to deal with the re-emergence of violence, the angst to relate to the past, the distortions that are the consequence of trauma. We also need to consider that traumatization can be a resource of cultural creativity. It is especially interesting to see how artists approach this topic in their works. For instance, the reign of the unspeakable, the shadows that haunt the collective consciousness, the void that cannot be filled anymore, the wounds that cannot be healed, the scars that will remain visible, the rubbles that are part of a reconstruction. I come to my fourth point. For aesthetic as well as for educational purposes, it is important to understand that acts of collective remembering have a performative quality. It seems to be crucial to understand memorial sites not as static objects, but as living entities. Performance theorist Brigitte Sion emphasizes that exploring a memorial site is not only about the place itself, but also about how people act in it. It is in this interaction that memorial sites unfold their power to shape the affects as well as the cognitive dimension. According to a process-relational approach, it is necessary to explore the activities that people engage in, how they interact with the objects that are present at the site, what kind of somatic modes of attention arise, what cognitive and affective responses are evoked. Does the memorial function as a place where those who are survivors of state-sponsored violence find a space to grieve the loss of their loved ones? Is the site a cemetery which holds the remains or the ashes of the deceased so that forms of ritual interaction with the dead are encouraged? A certain behavioral mode of decency, for instance? Does the memorial function as an open-ended artwork which ought to provoke free responses within the viewer? Is the memorial mainly a site for thanatourism? That means it serves the interests of tourists who want to learn more about a particular history or who are drawn to places which mediate contact with the dead, such as internment camps, catacombs, or cemeteries? Or do particular sites serve multiple purposes? And what kind of consequences does this entail? We invite you now to travel with us to Berlin, which has nowadays become a memorial site in itself, some might say. The capital of Germany is an interesting site since it engages a variety of mnemonic media. Memorial sites have been created everywhere that evoke a multiplicity of interactive performances. We will give you a few examples. Right here, we are standing in the midst of the official German monument that commemorates the Shoah. The memorial covers a 4.7-acre site right in front of the Berlin Reichstag with 2,711 steles, one for each page of the Talmud. They also evoke the shape of coffins. There's no attempt here to display personalized memory, but rather to show the power of mass murder that erases the singularity of the individual. The opposite is intended, however, in the information center situated underneath the monument, which attends to singular life stories and places. The steles are ordered in a crisscross pattern on a sloping ground. According to the architect Eisenman, he intended to evoke a perplexing atmosphere here for visitors who are wandering between the steles. The whole monument hints at the well-ordered, bureaucratic Nazi system of annihilation, which was out of touch with human reason and empathy. Eisenman refused to create a pedagogical frame which could have induced further explanations or educational instructions. One of the major points of critique, however, focuses on the creation of this kind of open-ended space. So today, when you visit the memorial, you can see people having lunch on the steles, taking a sunbath, or smoking a cigarette. Some of the people, however, they walk around in reverence and a sense of meditative silence. The performative space that is shaped by the visitors' interaction with the memorial can create a sense of bewilderment for guests who seek to find a place of respectful remembrance here. It might evoke Hannah Arendt's thoughts on the banality of evil, which hints at the ordinariness of lives lived day by day, while the most severe atrocities are happening. Some monuments, as some critics would say, carry the danger to trivialize and to domesticate the past. What you see here is a memorial created by the Israeli artist Mika Ullman called Die Bibliothek, the library. It is located at the Bebelplatz square in the center in Berlin, where the Nazi book burning happened in 1933. With the help of Nazi student organizations and numerous professors of the Humboldt University, about 20,000 books were burned at the exact spot where Ullman's memorial is located nowadays. This book burning was one of the significant symbolic acts which inaugurated the prohibition of free speech and thought in Germany. The burning of books became a political act which materialized the totalitarian state. The memorial itself consists of a translucent window on the surface of the plaza. Pedestrians and visitors can look into a room which has been built in the underground of the plaza. It has the size of 5 cubic meters. The white walls hold bookshelves which could carry about 20,000 books. The shelves remain empty. They are, however, illuminated and this way made visible. A bronze plaque bears a quote by the German poet Heinrich Heine from 1820. And this is all the beginning. Where books are burned, eventually people will burn. The memorial was inaugurated in May 1995. The artist says about his work, "It begins with a void that exists in every pit and will not disappear. You could say that emptiness is a state, a situation formed by the sides of the pit. The deeper it is, the more sky there will be, and the greater the void. In the library containing the missing books, that void is more palpable. We expect the books, but they are not there. If you want to understand something here, you have to draw close and you have to bow down." It is interesting to see how various artists who seek to deal with the violent past are drawn to an aesthetics of absence which thematizes the void, the emptiness, and the loss that emerges in the act of remembering. Let us give you another example. We are now in a residential area in Berlin-Mitte at the Koppenplatz. This is a neighborhood where once a very vibrant Jewish community had lived. In 1996, the artist Karl Biedermann created a sculpture which he entitled Der verlassene Raum, the deserted room. The sculpture depicts a table and two matching chairs. The rough base plate is textured like a parquet floor. It could be a dining room scene. One of the chairs is knocked over. The furniture are a little larger than ordinary furniture, yet amazingly realistic. It is only at close inspection or by touching them that one becomes aware that this is a bronze sculpture. This memorial captures a particular moment. It is the moment after deportation. We might imagine how someone had been forced to leave the room in a hasty manner. A chair has fallen down. What remains is a deserted room. Again, we have the motif of the void. The artwork involves us. It hints at a loss without giving consoling explanation. Perceiving and sensing a glimpse of this loss is the effectual gesture the sculpture offers. What remains is a gap that cannot be filled. A traumatic moment arises, like in a dream. The room once filled with people is not accessible anymore. Nobody will gather around this table anymore. Similar to Ullmann's library, an aesthetics of absence is materialized here. The ground has a band around it with verses from the poetry of Nelly Sachs, published in 1947. O houses of death, invitingly appointed, for the landlord of the house who once was a guest, laying the threshold like a knife between life and death. O your chimney stacks, O your fingers, and the body of Israel going up in smoke. We are arriving now at our last site, the Chapel of Reconciliation at the Bernauer Straße. The Chapel of Reconciliation is located in a neighborhood that was divided by the wall, the Berlin Wall, until 1989. It is nowadays part of a larger memorial park which keeps one of the few remains of the Berlin Wall that is still visible. This place holds painful memories about the once divided city. The neighborhood and the congregation were separated through a wall which was built where once houses stood. At least 5 people died at the Bernauer Straße who tried to flee into the western part of the city. Deeply engraved in the German cultural memory are the images of people throwing furniture out of the windows of houses of the Bernauer Straße as a desperate attempt to save at least some of their belongings. And then, more chilling, the images of people jumping out of the windows into the western part of the street. It was the day when the wall in Berlin was built at this site. Some people died at the attempt to leap into freedom. Neighbors, friends, and families were divided by the wall. As the wall was built, the church found itself as part of the death strip. It was now located in the prohibited zone that nobody was allowed to enter. The police at some point used the steeple of the church as a watchtower to observe and catch people who tried to flee from the eastern part into the western part. In 1985, another big event happened. The church was blown up to increase, as it was called, the safety, order, and cleanliness at the border to West Berlin. The church had long been a thorn in the eye of the GDR regime, a symbol for the separation of Germany. Probably nobody had seriously expected that the wall would fall only a couple of years later. It was in 1989 that the wall of Berlin came down. From that point on, the congregation was very much involved in reflecting on how the cultural memory of this place should be preserved. The congregation got engaged in the initiative Gedenkstätte Berlin, which lobbied for a memorial and a documentation center that focused on the history of this place. At the same time, a huge conflict arose if it was appropriate to leave remnants of the wall up for a memorial park. Nowadays, the Chapel of Reconciliation finds itself in the midst of a huge memorial park. Let us focus on a few details that this chapel holds. The congregation decided to choose clay as the basic building material. Clay, as they say, is a natural living construction material and consequently more easily damaged. The fragility of the structure testifies to the vulnerability of peace and reconciliation. Clay also signifies healing earth on the wounds of the place which should not be sealed. Accordingly, the liveliness of the material also symbolizes the possibility for transformation and the triumph over the location's place's tragic history. What is very impressive is that the loam clay was mixed with rubbles from the blown-up church that were found when the construction work for the chapel started. Those fragments are visible and tangible. Some shimmer in beautiful colors like turquoise through the warm golden brown color of the loam clay. Walls as wounds that are not to be sealed. In their fragility and liveliness, they give shelter to the memory that this place contains. Let us now take a look at the nave. Here we find the niche for the recovered, though damaged, retabule as a carving made of oak wood. It depicts the Last Supper. What is most striking is that Jesus' head is cut off. The same is true for the face of the disciple that Jesus loved most. The Last Supper, as well as the current gatherings for the Holy Meal around the altar, do not hide the traces of violence, but make them visible when people celebrate communion and the feast of the resurrection of the body. The wounds that this place bears are not to be covered up, and yet how those traces are made visible is not a clinging to a violent past. One can sense the spirit of hope in this place. The architectural shape holds new possibilities for the people of God together. The space that is created does not embody Christian triumphalism. It receives its power through its simplicity and its transitional energy. It is open to visitors who come and sit and try to comprehend what it means when governments divide cities, territories, landscapes, ethnic groups, congregations, and families by building walls such as this one. This chapel is open to visitors who come and pray for reconciliation in a world in which similar walls are continuously being built. As our travel to Berlin comes to a close, we hope that we have offered you some inspiration. We have shown you the work of artists who seek to be attentive to the complicated endeavor to remember violence in a way that is respectful to the dead. We have entered a memorial park that heightens our attentiveness for historical complexities and the myriads of stories a place can hold. We were confronted with an aesthetics of absence which evokes a sense of loss that can be haunting. We have seen artworks that make us pause. Many of these artworks also hold traces that are geared towards the future, towards the possibility of reconciliation. Das Ende.